The Satirical Analysis of Fight Club by Caitlin French, Justice Jensen, Murtaza Akhil, and Lauren Partlow.
Argument. The perceived emasculation by modern society is a self-created struggle leading some men to extreme measures to reclaim traditional masculinity. The definition of emasculate is to deprive a man of his male identity. This leads the men in the book to make radical decisions and go to great lengths in order to reclaim their perceived masculinity. In this presentation, we will discuss the different actions taken to reclaim masculinity and how these actions use satire to show the true nature of themselves. Violent masculinity. The first rule of Fight Club is you do not talk about Fight Club. The second rule of Fight Club is you do not talk about Fight Club. The narrator joins Fight Club in order to increase his sense of masculinity through violence. The violence in these fights make him feel alive again and more masculine. However, the true sense of masculinity comes from your appearance to others. When the narrator joins the secret club, he only allows himself to feel more masculine around these men. Not being able to share what happens at Fight Club robs him of masculinity in his everyday life, creating his own struggle with masculinity. Next is workplace masculinity. But this week we're doing a recall campaign, and this week the insomnia is back. Insomnia, and now the whole world figures to stop by and take a dump on my grave. The narrator works as a recall coordinator, a position that causes him to become constantly paranoid about his masculine identity. During periods of increased workload or recall campaigns, the narrator experiences increased stress about potential emasculation. This stems from the nature of his job, that being that A times B times C almost never equals the cost of a recall. Due to this, some situations come about where a recall may be absolutely necessary, but if the formula doesn't add up, no recall is issued. In these situations, the narrator is powerless and lacks any sense of control. This results in a feeling of emasculation because inside most men is some natural desire to control the situation he is in or have some effect on it. While the narrator remains at his job, his view of his masculine identity continues to deteriorate as he is robbed of control in every aspect. On top of this, the narrator also begins to fear how others view him by saying the whole world figures to stop by and take a dump on my grave. The narrator fears that everyone who has ever known him sees him the same way he sees himself, a helpless shell of a man. Next is comparative masculinity. My wish right now is for me to die. I am nothing in the world compared to Tyler. I am helpless, I am stupid, and all I do is want and need things. My tiny life, my little shit job, my Swedish furniture. The narrator begins the quote by comparing himself to someone else by directly pitting their masculinities against one another. The narrator exposes himself and his struggles with attempting to live a masculine life through material goods. The narrator views Tyler as more masculine because of Tyler is seen as brave, courageous, and strong. By degrading what he is himself, the narrator places other men above himself in his mind, leading to a cycle of comparison and self-emasculation.
The historical particulars of Fight Club, the crisis of masculinity. Generations have been working in jobs they hate just so they can buy what they don't really need. We don't have a great war in our generation or a Great Depression, but we do. We have a great war of the spirit. We have a great revolution against the culture. Only including major or extending conflicts and barring the Gulf War, the 1990s is widely considered as a decade of peace for the world. In this extended time of peace, there were shifts in roles of culture, and traditional male roles shifted with the lack of need for men in traditional military roles, accompanied by a growing economy. The war they refer to in this quote, is the shifts in the sexual division of labor led by more men in previously marketed female jobs. However, in these roles, men tended to get better pay and more hours than their female counterparts. Despite these increased conditions of their work, men started lashing out in response to being in these female roles and their perceived emasculation by having to occupy these roles, leading to the creation of stereotypes such as the angry white man depicted in this novel. Consumerism, culture, and masculinity. We are the middle children of history, raised by television to believe that someday we'll be millionaires and movie stars and rock stars, but we won't. And we're just learning this fact. In the 1990s, there was a rise in media preaching the necessity of meeting new expectations of masculinity with the shift of traditional roles. The new lad model preached authenticity and self-fulfillment with the specific focus on the need of mass consumption to achieve this. Magazines such as Loaded, Maxim, and Men's Health brought about new ways for young men to purchase products that would give them a chance to achieve their goal of looking like rock stars and movie stars. And the male identity became intrinsically tied to material possessions during this time, rather than the previously believed physical strength model of masculinity. Through the wide purchase of products and availability of tips and tricks for young men, this allowed for compliance of traditional masculine ideas through validation of consumerism, which led to a conflict with the shift towards materialistic values and openness about male aesthetics, as some believers of the traditional male model felt that these were not truly masculine processes.
In Fight Club, the lack of masculinity is often seen as a weakness by the narrator. On page 46, the narrator says, "Deliver me, Tyler, from being perfect and complete." He feels that being perfect and complete are not aspects that come with masculinity, and he really wants to achieve the level of masculinity that Tyler possesses. This is satirized in the novel Fight Club because masculinity is often something people think of, but don't think of specific qualities when they look at one another. They know overall in their heads what possesses masculinity, but they don't particularly think perfect and complete is not part of it. And so this is part of the novel that kind of steers away from the general satire and uses fiction to show that Tyler is someone that the narrator really strives to be like. Also, on page 53, the narrator states, "I felt finally I could get my hands on everything in the world that didn't work." This happens shortly after the quote from above, and this is when the narrator sees himself starting to become more like Tyler. This transformation happens slowly over the novel and then becomes very abrupt about 3/4 of the way through, when it is discovered that Tyler and the narrator are the same person. However, until that reveal, the narrator really struggles with his lack of masculinity, and he feels that this paints it as an overall weakness compared to Tyler. Additionally, throughout the novel, it is emphasized that toxic masculinity is a way of life. Through Project Mayhem, toxic masculinity is emphasized, and many of the actions taken by the characters are extreme and often dangerous. The narrator states that maybe self-improvement isn't the answer. Tyler never knew his father, and maybe self-destruction is the answer. This quote came about when Fight Club was first created, which later led to the creation of Project Mayhem. As we know, Project Mayhem led to the death of Bob, who was a beloved character in the novel. And also, this quote characterizes Tyler as a person. It shows that he only wants self-destruction, and because the narrator is aspiring to be like Tyler, that means he will be on this path of self-destruction as well. The book really emphasizes that toxic masculinity is a way of life, which is not often how we think when we think of toxic masculinity in general. This is another example of satire throughout the novel, because often toxic masculinity is seen as negative. However, it's not seen as being a way of life for many people. However, this novel really characterizes toxic masculinity and makes it seem as if it's the only way of life and the way of life that the narrator strives for.
The critique and who it is aimed at. Quote, "This was the very end of summer. and I was asleep. Tyler was naked and sweating, gritty with sand, his hair wet and stringy hanging in his face. Page 32. What the critique is saying here is that men, when they have an ego that is inflated or an ego that they're not secure with but are rather insecure, grab on to a quote unquote ideal alpha male esque figure. This is seen today with men hanging on to characters such as Andrew Tate that personifies the Tyler Durden esque level of absurdity. And we see this within this quote with the narrator speaking of his first instance meeting Tyler Durden. It's almost an obsessive level of detail, and to a point it becomes strangely sexual due to how descriptive it is. And again, this is due to the satire of men being insecure with their masculinity and hanging on to their quote unquote ideal man, which in itself sounds absurd. The reason for the critique. The book hits different points, but this critique is to show the absurdity of the male ego and how men put themselves in these situations. When the male ego is emasculated, as seen with the narrator, they, and in this case, he, the narrator, will do things to achieve the quote unquote ideal male mental and physical status. And said prior, it's to become something greater than what the man thinks he is. In this case, the narrator putting his physical and mental well being to appease Tyler because the narrator is obsessed with Tyler. Of course, we learn that he can't help it, but he makes no effort to push away Tyler, but to become more infatuated with him and to become like Tyler. Most, if not all, instances are self-perpetuated by male insecurity. It it's to the point where the narrator has a gun pulled to his head, and he's the one who's gonna do it, and he's the one who ends up shooting himself in the movie. And of course, there's more in the book. But the point is, the male character, the narrator, he put himself in the situation chasing Tyler Durden. And this is seen today in society with, again, men buying certain quote unquote self help guides from Gary Vee or Andrew Tate. But in the end, they're getting scammed. They might lose a lot of their money hoping to become this quote unquote alpha male, but they're isolating themselves from their family and going into a bigoted and misogynistic viewpoint. And this is the reason for the critique to and hopefully show the audience, the male, that these things are self-perpetuated, that the idea of an ideal male and comes from being insecure and not having self-confidence and perpetuating yourself into a cycle of despair and hurt and harm to appease an absurd ideology. Coming out of this presentation, I think there are two main questions that one can ask themselves. The first one being, do you think Fight Club's approach would be different if it was set in this day and age? Of course, the book and movie came out in the 90s, and it's only 20 years prior to today, but a lot has changed in this 20 years as society has gotten more socially progressive and mental health has been on the forefront. Would the Fight Club take a different approach? And if the approach is different, why do you think the audience of Fight Club tend to fail to recognize the critiques being made? Is that something that goes back to how the book and the movie was prompted, or is it simply the sacrifice one has to make when trying to make a captivating movie or book that the main point goes over the head for the sake of entertainment?